It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Matt Vickers, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats Daisy Cooper, Editor of the Norwich Evening News Richard Porritt, and author and broadcaster Timandra Harkness. Today,
the public expects this House to protect our borders. They expect us to combat the dinghies crossing the English Channel.
It hasn't worked so far as a record number of migrants make the crossing. The US climate envoy is in the UK with this stark message.
Farms that are flooded, crops that don't grow anymore in one place or another, that there is now a growing awareness, I am convinced, among people that we have to do something.
We'll talk about this interview.
Within days of the election, you were discussing getting rid of him.
Yes. Well, for all the reasons we've been discussing.
And Boris Johnson is still isolating, but he'll face Keir Starmer in the last PMQs before the summer. Let's start with that exclusive interview between Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor to Boris Johnson, with the BBC's political editor Laura Kuenssberg. You heard a clip, an excerpt of that interview there in the headlines. Let's just play you a little bit more.
Before even mid-January, we were having meetings in Number 10 saying it's clear that Kerry wants rid of all of us. At that point, we were already saying that by the summer, either we'll all have gone from here or we'll be in the process of trying to get rid of him and get someone else in as Prime Minister.
But you've just said that within months of the Prime Minister winning the biggest Conservative majority in decades, you and a few others from the Vote Leave campaign were discussing the possibility of getting rid of him.
Days, not months.
Within days of the election, you were discussing getting rid of him.
Yes. Well, for all the reasons we've been discussing.
So, I mean, Timandra, that is a pretty extraordinary thing to say. Dominic Cummings was plotting, it seems, to get rid of Boris Johnson within days of the election in 2019. What do you make of it?
Well, who does he think he is, really? I mean, he's an unelected advisor. Boris is free to hire him and, I imagine, to fire him, unless he's a member of a trade union. And I just don't think it's his business to get rid of elected politicians. You know, you can say Boris isn't a good Prime Minister and we should get him rid of him, but that's the job of the electorate. And I think, you know, whereas Dominic Cummings in some ways has some good criticisms of how government is done, I think overall the huge blind spot he has is that in a democracy, what matters is the demos, is the electorate, it's the people who elect politicians, who vote in referendums, and we have the final say, and that's as it should be. I think he's really deluded about that, to be honest. Well,
Richard, what did you make of it?
Yeah, it was real blockbuster stuff, wasn't it? I thought it was a wonderful interview by Laura, and I agree. I think Dominic Cummings has perhaps got thinks his status is perhaps more important than it is. But you know, for us who are interested in the chatter and the gossip around Westminster, it's fascinating. I think if I was to speak to the average man or woman on the street here in Norwich, I think they would probably think that this is a bit playground, frankly.
Daisy, your view?
Well, I can only imagine what it's like being one of the families of the bereaved, knowing that from the get-go, this government has been so focused on ripping shreds out of each other that they haven't been looking after the British public. And of course, at the start, we didn't know there was going to be a global health pandemic, but it's clear that they were all so busy throwing mud at each other and engaging in briefing wars that clearly has made a contribution to the many, many mistakes that we've seen over the last year or so.
What did you make of it, Matt, when you heard Dominic Cummings say that?
You hit the nail right on the head there when we were talking about the fact that, you know what, this is a democratic process. He was elected by the people. I remember Dominic I remember him telling us how he wanted to leave the EU because we were controlled. You know, the power was in the hands of unelected bureaucrats. He is an unelected bureaucrat, and I don't think at any point he should have been discussing whether Boris was the right guy for the job. I think that's down to the electorate. I think that's down to democracy.
Right. I mean, in terms of campaigning, though, he did actually make Brexit happen, didn't he? Or certainly had a pretty leading role in it.
I'm sure. Do you know what? I don't know the guy. I've never met the chap. And I read the newspapers the same as everybody else, and I have to make judgment calls on that. Lots of the accusations that have come out from Dominic Cummings, we haven't heard any evidence on any of them. You know, they're often put up there and they fill the front page of newspapers, and they sell a lot of newspapers, I assume, but we don't really hear any evidence behind them, and it's never brought to any sort of platform where we can have a realistic discussion about what the accusations are.
Well, of course, he has said, though, Matt, hasn't he, that he is prepared, like others, no doubt, to go on oath and also repeat many of the claims and allegations that he said. And also, we've seen text messages and WhatsApps that are from the Prime Minister.
We've seen lots of things bandied around, lots of mud thrown, and you know what? People can make up their own minds, but actually there is no evidence. And one person's interpretation of something's very different to another.
Message for Dominic Cummings?
We've heard you. We've heard everything you've had to say. Time to move on.
All right, well, we'll do that, indeed. Let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Express. Migrant crisis. Patel pays French £54 million to do their job. Obviously talking about the Home Secretary trying to get an agreement in terms of stopping the crossings that we've seen so much of over the last year or so. Let's talk to Simon Jones, BBC reporter in Dover. Simon, while you're talking, we're going to show pictures that your team and your cameraman have filmed today. Take us through the numbers, particularly since we only spoke about a month ago when you already said they were on the rise and reaching record numbers.
Yeah, well, in the past few days, we've had almost 1,000 migrants reach the UK by boat, and that brings the total for this year to 8,400 people. Now, that's already higher than the number we saw arriving by boat in the whole of last year. But a bit of context, there has been a similar drop in the number of people arriving by other means, such as in the back of lorries. But today has been another busy day for the border force. It's really calm out there in the Channel. And so once again, we've seen several boats of migrants brought to the shore here in Dover. There's one currently being brought in behind me at the moment. And while this weather continues, this pattern is likely to continue too. And that's why we've had the Home Secretary talking tough. Priti Patel is saying that the British public is fed up of seeing images of these crossings. They're angry about it. And that's why she struck a new deal with the French authorities.
Right, but what's happening to people? As you say, we're looking at people dismounting from what looks like a border office boat. But what's happening to them when they actually come ashore?
Well, initially, they are processed here at the port of Dover, so they're asked to give their identity, their photos are taken, they're monitored for signs of COVID. Then they'll be transported to a holding centre where they'll spend perhaps 2 or 3 days, and then people will be dispersed around the country, and the vast majority will claim asylum. Now, according to the government, the system is broken because too many migrants are simply shopping where they want to claim asylum. The government saying they should be asking for asylum in the first safe country they come to. So if people have passed through safe EU countries, they should be claiming asylum here. In the short term, what the government is doing is throwing some money at the issue, giving France an extra £54 million. That's going to increase the number of French police officers patrolling the beaches in northern France, increase aerial surveillance. But if you think perhaps we've heard this before, go back to November, and at that stage, Britain and France agreed a new deal with Britain giving France £25 million to increase the number of police officers and surveillance. But the numbers have continued to rise, arriving by boat at least. So I think there is some real pressure on Priti Patel now to really say what this money is going to be used for and see some successes from it.
All right, Simon Jones, thank you very much there in Dover. And, of course, the Nationality and Borders Bill has been in Parliament. It passed its second reading. This is the government's attempt to try and address this by making it a criminal offence to arrive illegally, not just in the country, but even if you're intercepted out at sea. Let me just show you this, though, from the Home Secretary. This is from last August. I'm working to make this route unviable. This involves, 1, stopping the boats leaving France in the first place, 2, intercepting boats and returning those attempting to make a crossing. This is complex to do and we face serious legislative, legal and operational barriers. This was last August. It's not working, is it, Matt?
Well, I think what you saw yesterday was months and months of work brought forward in a bill with every trick in the book is being thrown at this, whether that be doubling the number of French police officers on the shores trying to stop it, which is what this money is going to do, or whether it be yesterday where we're changing the entire legal framework around it, making it offence, tackling those awful criminal gangs who put people onto dinghies, 50 people on a dinghy floating across the sea, putting people's lives at risk and profiting from the process.
Right, so why have the numbers of people arriving gone up, not down?
Do you know what? If there was an easy, quick fix to this, it would have happened. There isn't. Yesterday there was legislation going through the House. People were opposing it. There were people on this show who opposed that yesterday, who opposed the fact that we should make it an offence, that we should toughen up the sentences for those people smugglers, that we should, we shouldn't give those additional powers to the border forces to be able to turn people around, to be able to take vessels off people. It's on its way, and we are doing everything we can.
Right.
And I know that there's someone in the Home Office who is committed to doing everything she can.
Right. Well, Matt is talking about you, Daisy, being one of those who voted against the legislation he says, and the government says, is actually going to tackle this.
Let's be absolutely clear about what is happening here. We've got some of the most vulnerable people in the world who are escaping war and persecution. And because this Conservative government refuses to provide safe and legal routes for people to apply to seek asylum in the UK safely, these people are deliberately being driven into the hands of criminal gangs and being exploited and trafficked. This is a result of the Conservative government's policy. Now, if they are serious about taking people out of the hands of criminal gangs who traffic them across the Channel, the quickest and simplest way to do that is for the Conservative government to reinstate safe and legal routes for some of the world's most vulnerable people fleeing war and persecution to apply to come to this country, and they flat out refuse to do that.
Matt?
You know what? We cannot have an asylum system that sees it as acceptable for people to be thrown on dinghies and arrive on the coast. That is not a thing. That is not acceptable. And actually, when I speak to genuine refugees from my part of the world, refugees who've come and settled in my part of the world, I speak to them. They are not people. Well, they don't fit the profile of do you know what? Is it 80% of them are basically male, 75% of them are aged between 18 and 39. That's the people coming off the boats. The genuine asylum seekers in my part of the world, they won't cross 5 safe countries to get here, and they don't have $5,000 to buy a ticket for a dodgy dinghy. The real asylum seekers, we need to look after them. If the system,
own statistics.
if we allow this system to be flooded by illegal migrants, we will never have a decent...
Right, don't talk over each other, but yes, finish your point and then I'll go...
The system is stretched to capacity because we're allowing this to happen. We need to get tough and we need to stop it happening.
Right, well, Daisy, do you accept that some, maybe many, of the people making that crossing are economic migrants?
No, and the Home Office's own evidence says that that's not the case. So the Home Office's own evidence says that 98% of people who get on those boats make an asylum claim, and less than 10% of those people are refused asylum in the country because they don't have a genuine claim. So the Home Office's own evidence says that that's not the case. But in addition, this claim that somehow we're overwhelmed with asylum seekers is simply not true. If you look across Europe, the UK is actually 19th in terms of the number of migrants that we bring into the country. There are many other countries in Europe that take many, many more. And as I say, the Home Office's own evidence says 98% of those people on the boat claim asylum and less than 10% of those are refused.
Right, Timandra, I'm just going to read you, and the others, of course, this from an MP in Calais who says having more money, this is the £54 million that's been agreed, having more police, having more controls will not prevent more crossing attempts. What do you say? It's not going to work.
Well, I think there's actually... I find myself agreeing slightly with some of what Matt said and some of what Daisy said, because I think part of the problem here is a kind of stick-carrot thing. You want to get a bigger stick to discourage people who have already done the equivalent of skateboarding across a motorway by trying to cross one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world in a dinghy, which is, really dangerous and should be discouraged. They're also being ripped off by people traffickers. This has probably happened all the way back in their journey. So you want to discourage that. But one way to do that is to open up more easier, fairer, legal channels for people to claim asylum, so that for them the incentive is to try and do that sooner and closer to their own country without making these dangerous journeys. And then you disincentivise people taking the dangerous routes and you incentivise people to try and take a safe legal route. So I don't think the overall figures of people coming in are huge. I think they've actually gone down. It's just that because there are fewer flights and fewer lorries and so on, more of them are doing the dangerous dinghy route. But what obviously can't cope is the system of processing them. And then what do you do with people who've maybe been here 3 years, and then you say, actually, you know, you're not an asylum seeker, and, you know, fair play to you, you wanted a better life, but you've come in illegally, and then what? And then where do you send them back to? I think it's really difficult.
Right. Well, I mean, we'll come on to that issue of the processing in terms of agreement with France. But Richard, what's it like in your area? I mean, do people smugglers use sea routes to East Anglia?
Yes, we've not had a huge amount of it, but it's certainly on the radar. I mean, I think a lot of the rhetoric on this is pretty inhumane, I think. I think we've got to remember that to make a decision to go across the Channel or a different route in a dinghy is a pretty big one, whether you're a man aged 18 or whatever. I mean, I strongly believe that the vast majority of these people who make the crossing are in dire straits. And I think that is something we really do need to remember when we're talking about figures. And my other concern is with this money is, are we just going to move this problem somewhere else? Or are we going to try and solve it? Because I think the problem occurs, doesn't it, long before anyone gets to Calais, and certainly long before anyone gets to Dover. It's just our problem then. So I think, you know, throwing money at it is perhaps not the answer that's going to solve it longer term. I think it'll just move it elsewhere.
Right. I mean, Matt, do you think you do need to dial down the rhetoric when it comes to this particular issue? And also, whatever is done, whether it's legislation or whether money is thrown at it, nothing seems to deter people who want a new life for whatever reason. So in the end, to Mandra's point about opening up, and Daisy's, opening up more routes that are easier and safer would reduce people then making that crossing.
We talk about the tough decision to get in a dinghy and cross that channel. What's so wrong with France? If you are travelling through safe countries, the refugees in my part of the world have seen atrocities that I wouldn't dare to even imagine. They wouldn't be travelling through 5 countries and paying £5 to get on a dinghy. You know, there is a system. We would be able to... The system at the moment is overwhelmed. There are too many people in the process. That's what's happening, because I speak to genuine people in my part of the world who've come here as asylum seekers. They're struggling to get the interviews, to get through the process. The only way that we can create safe routes or expand the safe route is by closing this illegal practice down, stopping these criminal gangs profiteering from the plights of others. It's just wrong, and we've got to get on with the job of stopping it.
Daisy, final word?
Well, I think we have to recognise that many of the people who are trying to come to the UK are doing so to actually reunify with their own families. And if I was separated from my family, I would do everything possible to reach them, whatever country they were in. But also, the other thing is a lot of people who are in France have no control over their end destination, because if you are being trafficked and you're in the hands of a criminal gang, they will still continue to try and get you to the UK if that's what their intention is. So many of these people have no control over their end destination. So if the government could focus on creating safe and legal routes, many people wouldn't be trying to take this journey in the first instance, and we wouldn't have this problem in the Channel.
They didn't fly into Charles de Gaulle Airport and start talking about coming through Calais. They've come a long way, and there are lots of options along the route. By making this crossing unviable, we can make people look at alternative, safe, legal routes. That's the way forwards.
Let's have a look at this story in the Norwich Evening News, Richard's paper. It says, city landlords' defiant message to punters. No vax, get out of my pub. Let's talk about COVID passports, Richard. Tell us about this story.
Yeah, this really took off for us last week. Very famous pub called the Murderers in Norwich, who said...
The Murderers?
It's actually called the Gardener's Arms. It's a very old pub. There's a story behind the name, which I won't go into now, but check it out online. It's a great pub. A big favourite of my reporters. They had staff that were pinged and they had to close twice. They missed, semi-finals in the Euros and the final they were closed for. And the landlord, Phil Cutter, took a decision that if you wanted to come in, you would need to have at least a single vaccine or be able to provide a negative test. And it caused quite a stir. A lot of the details of the pubs and the story were shared in sort of anti-vaxxers web groups and WhatsApp groups and whatnot, and he caught a lot of flack for it. He's standing by it, and we're standing by his right to make the choice for his staff and his customers. And I think there was a lot of people saying, well, this is discrimination. You're discriminating against people. His line is, well, you can always go and drink somewhere else. And we back him on that. Not every pub in Norwich is doing the same, although there are others, certainly. And we're going to see the same thing, of course, for nightclubs, it seems, in the autumn. So, you know, if you don't like it, go somewhere else.
Right. Well, yes. What do you think, Tamandra? That business owner has the right to do that.
Yeah, I think when you're a private business and people don't have to come to your pub, then it's fair enough. And from the sound of it, it is largely frustration with the fact that if somebody in there later has a positive test and then his staff get pinged and he has to close down, I understand this is a huge problem for all sorts of venues and employers. So, I mean, you know, for me, even though I've had COVID and 2 jabs, I would probably go somewhere else because I would feel it was discrimination, but it is up to him. The thing I have a real problem with is when the government starts to say, we're going to take away your right to go to nightclubs or whatever. We're going to basically take away some of your civil liberties unless you go and get vaccinated, because that is coercion to get medical treatment. And when we're talking about younger people, if you're talking about the under 30s, if they're otherwise healthy, it's medical treatment that's not really for their benefit. It's really for the benefit of the whole of society, so that we can get to that point where COVID really is like the flu and we can start to live with it in a more normal way.
So this is coercion, Matt. This would be, in a way, COVID passports by stealth. Yes, the guidance is that businesses can make up their own minds, but with nightclubs, as we know from the end of September, you will have to be double jabbed before you gain entry.
So in this particular case of the murderer's arms or whatever it is, I think actually, you know what? Good on him. I made a rule in life never to mess with the pub landlord. It's never helpful. And the guy who runs my local...
pub's called the Murderer.
Exactly. That might be good advice.
My local's a pretty big lad. But I think actually when you look at it in the real sense of things, there are people, I've spoken to people who are not that keen on going out yet, who are avoiding going out. This is a place that they might feel more comfortable going. Some people like to go to Wetherspoons where the cheap booze is. Some people like to go to places where there's music. This is a choice. It's a choice he's putting on. I think some of the customers might well like it. Right. And in terms of the wider issue about clubs, when I speak to people who run businesses, when I speak to people who run clubs, when I speak to people who go to clubs, the worst thing that can happen is if we end up in another lockdown or we end up shutting those clubs. And do I want to... I'm not a fan of these passports. I think it's a mess around. But if this is what it takes to allow these businesses to operate and to allow people to live with the virus, then we've got to get on with it.
Right. Well, Daisy, the distinction, of course, is between the government mandating this in the case of nightclubs and business owners like the pub landlord at the Murderers making up their own mind what they want to do.
Well, first of all, I can testify to the fact that the Murderers is, in fact, an absolutely cracking pub.
Right, all right, we're going to do a trip there. I can see it coming when we all can.
Brilliant. Good stuff. I'll bring my vaccine record. But there is a big distinction. And I think the problem with the government approach is that COVID ID cards, which is essentially what they are unworkable, incredibly expensive, and they are discriminatory. And I think what we've seen is that a number of people in the nighttime industry and lots of nightclubs and potentially other places, because it's not just nightclubs, it could be theatres or other places we just don't know yet, they're all saying it's so expensive and it's so unworkable. This is creating more red tape for us. Effectively, if you say that we can only open up by requiring COVID ID cards, right, you're effectively saying that we have to remain closed because there's actually no choice for us because they are so unworkable and divisive. So I think what the government needs to do is to come clean about whether it's safe for these places to reopen. And if they can reopen safely, then let's see the plans for how that can happen, with the government putting more investment into rapid testing and paying people to self-isolate. But at the moment, there is really no choice here for some of these businesses. They're saying it's unworkable, it's expensive, it's red tape.
Why is it unworkable? Because we've just heard Richard explain that it is working with this particular pub. I mean, there is an app that you can use and show your vaccination status. So what's unworkable about it? You may not like it, and it may be the wrong thing, but what's unworkable?
So I think one of the issues is that people are saying, well, there are probably ways in which people can get around this, and they can maybe have sort of fake passports, and that then you'll be asking people on the door to actually regulate what is and what isn't a genuine vaccine ID card. And then you have the issue of the costs, and and also having to pay people on the door, basically asking bouncers effectively to have to patrol this. And I think it creates it creates a false sense of security, because even with the vaccines, we know the vaccines have weakened the link between hospitalisation and death, but we know that even with both of your jabs, you can still catch COVID and you can still pass it on. So we need to have other measures in place. And actually, I would much rather the government put all of its time, effort and money into making sure that masks are mandatory in indoor closed spaces, invest in forcing people to self-isolate. Those are the measures that we know will work. COVID ID cards, as I say, they're problematic, unworkable and discriminatory.
All right, well, let me just put this poll to you. YouGov poll, 71% of Britons support people being required to show proof of double vaccination in order to get into nightclubs. Now, we have a breakdown by age. It won't surprise you, Tamandra, that 90% of over 65-year-olds, but even 57% of 18 to 24-year-olds support the idea.
I think a lot of people are so desperate to get out of this pandemic that they are saying, just as Matt just said, look, if that's what it takes, then whatever. But I think this is very dangerous, because if we start to say that our basic freedoms and civil liberties are tradable and contingent, and, well, what does it really matter if the government makes you share your medical records in order to go to a nightclub? It's better than a lockdown. Then we will find ourselves in a point where we don't actually have any of these civil liberties, and we've set a precedent that the government can simply take them away for very contingent reasons. This is a horrible pandemic, but it's not the Black Death. We have to get a balance about what risks are acceptable and what liberties we value. Right. If we let the government say, well, look, basically the truth is we want to get young people to get vaccinated, and the young people have twigged that they're not really at risk of getting seriously ill from this, and so they haven't bothered. But in order to get back to the stage where enough of us have immunity that we can get on with our lives, we need them to. So we're going to use this big stick, again, the big stick of you can't go to nightclubs unless you have your jabs. And I just don't think... the extreme example is somebody could come to me and say, will you donate one of your kidneys to save somebody else? And, I might well do that as an act of altruism, but there should be no law that says I have to do it. And for that matter, there should be no law that says I can take a lot of money. Although this might be about safety to other people and having some sort of... This is what I'm saying, that there's an altruistic reason why we should say to young people, look, for you, the medical benefit is probably negligible, but the benefit to society as a whole, and perhaps to older people and more vulnerable people that you're in contact with, is that you're much less likely to pass it on to them. So for that reason, please get vaccinated. But at the end of the day, it's a medical procedure. It's got to be freely consented. Matt?
I think, do you know what? It's a valid point, but I hate the whole thing. I hate the fact that I'm in Parliament restricting people's freedoms. But I think the devil's in the detail in a lot of these things. And actually, when you look at... Do you remember when this was first mooted and we talked about you would need a COVID passport to get into a pub or a restaurant? That would have been madness, but there is an element of balance. And actually, when you look at a nightclub, it's the ultimate mixing vessel, isn't it? I think that's what Professor Tam said.
Vector of transmission, isn't it?
That's it. The ultimate vector of transmission, mixing vessel, same thing. But to me, I think they are. If you look at all the things that we haven't been doing for the last 18 months, that's what goes on in a nightclub. And actually, I hate the idea of it. I think it's an absolute pain.
But you're going to vote for it?
But I'm going to, if this is what it takes to keep clubs in my part of the world open so that young people can still go to clubs, so that businesses can operate and we can get the economy moving, then that's what it's going to take.
All right, and apparently from July the 21st, people in France will need to show a health pass. That's going to come in effect amid a surge of new infections, in particular the Delta virus. So we will wait to see what happens here. Let's move on and talk about this story in the Financial Times. Push to redraw Brexit trade deal sets collision course with Brussels. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Adam, this has been billed as a very big day when it comes to what's known as the Northern Ireland Protocol. You've got the Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, in the Commons shortly. And we're also going to hear from Lord Frost, the chief Brexit negotiator, in the House of Lords. So, yes, big day. Is anything significant going to happen or change?
I think today will be much more about atmospherics and about stuff that the UK wants to achieve and tools they might use to achieve that, rather than anything actually changing. I also predict we'll get probably quite a muted response from the EU as they then process what the UK publishes today. Then I also predict over the summer there'll be some under-the-radar negotiations between the two sides, and then there'll be something that feels a bit like a crisis in September when everyone comes back from holiday, because that's when some deadlines expire related to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think that's the sequence of events that we'll get. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of rhetoric today, but what the real experts will be doing will be reading between the lines to work out what the UK really wants to get and where the possible agreement with the EU could be. And it's worth just taking a step back and just thinking about what's actually happening here. So over the last few months, the UK and the EU have been trying to kind of smooth the edges off the Northern Ireland Protocol to make it a bit easier for people who are affected by it and businesses who have to live with it. Now, the EU has shown some flexibility on some things like the rules for transporting guide dogs across the Irish Sea, and they're also going to change EU law so that medicines registered in Great Britain can be sold and used in Northern Ireland from next year, which was something that was looking like it wasn't going to happen as a result of the protocol. So the EU has moved a bit, but nowhere near enough for the UK. And the sort of stuff that the Financial Times is talking about as UK asks are much wider exemptions from checks for many more businesses and cover more types of goods. And also, is there a way of taking the European Court of Justice out of the protocol altogether? Is looking like what the UK would quite like. But I think some of that will be quite hard for the EU to swallow. But the short version is Brexit's done, but it's also not done because there's an almost permanent process of negotiation over the Ireland Protocol.
Right. Well, there's a slight sense of déjà vu in some of the stuff you're saying in your tone there, Adam, in terms of what might or might not happen. But what about the nuclear option that is still available? Is that likely in the rhetoric?
So in the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is a clause called Article 16, which allows either party to suspend parts of the agreement in extreme circumstances. And you remember the EU toyed with using that when they were discussing limiting the export of vaccines at the start of the year. Well, the UK is now going to say, we think that there's been such a diversion of trade within the UK that would justify Britain pulling the Article 16 lever, if you like. But they're not going to do it today because they'd rather have constructive negotiations with the EU and try to find a way forward. So they're sort of threatening to pull the lever with their hand hovering above it rather than actually grabbing the lever and pulling it.
Right, what about atmospherics, as you were saying? Is there love between the EU and Lord Frost at this particular point?
There is not a lot of love between the UK and the EU this week because the tension's actually been rising in other areas as well. There's going to have to be a separate negotiation over how Brexit affects Gibraltar and the interaction with the Spanish government. And yesterday, the EU adopted their negotiating mandate for those talks. And straight away, the Foreign Office, Dominic Raab, rejected it, saying what the EU wants and the Spanish government wants is too much of a power grab from the sovereignty of Gibraltar. And they couldn't even start the negotiations on the basis of that document. So the tension has already been rising when it comes to Gibraltar before the tension then rises a lot more today as a result of the statements we'll get in the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
Well, a bit like the heat outside. Adam, thank you very much for bringing us up to date. Well, Daisy, doesn't this rather suggest that rather than have their hands hovering over the lever, the government should actually pull it and go for the nuclear option? Let's see this story in BBC News. M&S, Marks & Spencer's, to cut Christmas products in Northern Ireland because of the checks and because of the trading arrangements currently.
I mean, first of all, isn't it extraordinary that we're here in 2021, the middle of 2021, and with all the hot air about oven-ready deals and getting Brexit done, here we are still trying to figure out the details. I think what we need the UK government to stop ramping up the rhetoric. It is counterproductive to have threats of unilateral action. We need cool heads to prevail. And I think what we need is for the UK to engage constructively with the EU, potentially talk about the use of grace period extensions to get a long-term and sustainable solution, because all this ramping up the rhetoric does absolutely nothing for the people who are caught in the middle of the whole situation.
Right. What about the EU? Do you think it's on them as well to dial down some of the rhetoric in order to reach an agreement?
I think both sides have to engage constructively, and both sides, it is incumbent on both sides to make sure they do dial down this rhetoric. We need to have the UK and the EU working collaboratively and collectively to find a long-term, permanent, sustainable solution that will work for the people of the United Kingdom. And at the moment, ramping up the rhetoric helps neither side. Right.
Matt, do you actually think the government should override the agreement and go for the nuclear option with the EU and trigger Article 16 now?
I think you know what? Northern Ireland is a huge part of the UK, fundamental to our market. They sell 5 times as many goods to the UK as they do to Ireland. In real terms, this agreement was built on 2 partners who would come to the table and be positive and upbeat and constructive. Actually, what we saw in January, where we saw the EU blocking life-saving vaccines coming in, and we saw them, put the peace process at risk. That is not, it's not a collegial partner who's working with us to get something done. I think we go back to the drawing board with them. We try to find a way forward. The protocol was built on a common understanding, on a shared interest. We need to get around the table and draw that up again and see where we get to. I think the EU don't always play it easy, do they? Usually you've got to play it hardball, and we lead things to the very wire, as we've seen. So it might be that that's something that has to come onto the table at some point, but I think there's still the opportunity to engage constructively and find a way forward.
Why shouldn't the EU protect its single market?
I think, do you know what? We're working as a pair, we're working as partners in this. The things that went on with blocking vaccines, that has completely... We talk about rhetoric. That wasn't rhetoric. It was real action that put a lot of lives at risk and put the peace process at risk. This is real action, not rhetoric and noise.
Richard?
It's difficult to like either side in this one at the moment. I feel it's a bit like watching Leeds play Millwall or something. But I
can't sort of tell, having never watched a match like that.
Well, as a Huddersfield Town fan, it is a little bit like watching Leeds play. I think the difference is when it really starts to impact real people's lives. And if we're already starting to see empty shelves, I believe, and that's when the heat really arrives. I mean, the only people to blame, though, for us to get to this point are the people who signed the deal, surely. You know, each side is blaming each other, but we signed the deal. Did we not see this coming? I mean, it's shocking to me.
Tamandra?
Well, yeah, it was never a very good deal, was it? And I know it was unpopular at the time when people said, yeah, it's actually quite a rubbish deal because everyone was so desperate. Well, not everyone. Some people wished it would never happen, and everyone else was so desperate for it to finally happen after all the years of shenanigans. But, yeah, it was just papering over a crack. It was lining a problem up that was going to be a problem. And I don't know, why would we ever expect the EU to be collegial and give us an easy time? They don't want other countries to be thinking about leaving. They want to make it as difficult as possible.
All right, well, we'll bring you up to date with that tomorrow after the statements in the House. Let's talk about John Kerry, who's the climate envoy to Joe Biden in the US. He's made a speech, he's in town, and he said this.
The International Energy Agency has laid out the reductions that are needed at a global scale. And their statistics imply that if China sticks with its current plan and does not peak its emissions until 2030, then the entire rest of the world would have to go to zero by 2040 or even 2035. It knocks at least a decade off the timeline for the rest of the world to decarbonize. And that, my friends, sets a goal that currently is impossible to achieve.
Daisy, you're on the all-party climate group. When people hear that, they may ask themselves, what's the point here in the UK of taking further radical steps to change my life if the world's biggest polluter, China, continues to emit at the same levels?
Well, let's be honest, I don't think people are asking that question. I think people are absolutely banging at the door to want our government and every government around the world to take this climate crisis seriously. You know, we have less than, I think, 9 years now to stop irreparable damage to our planet. And we do need every single country and every single person to play their part.
But hang on, Daisy, you would accept that the government has set quite challenging targets, I think, by most people's assumptions, and they're actually and have achieved rather a lot in terms of cutting carbon emissions, certainly since 1990s levels.
Well, as you say, I'm a vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group on climate change, and we've engaged a think tank to do an independent audit of the government's announcements and across the 6 major areas that contribute to carbon emissions in this country. The UK government is scoring 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10, 5 out of 10 on most of those areas. So the government isn't going anywhere near far enough to tackle this. And in fact,
fine. But my point, and perhaps what John Kerry was saying, that does it matter if China continues to emit at that rate when people see that bigger picture, that the sort of action we'd have to take here would be so unachievable? John Kerry is saying impossible in order to mitigate what's going on there. How do you deal with that? How do you tell people?
we simply can't throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, well, let's just go along with this. Let's just see the planet burn, can we? Every single one of us has to do something. And the more that every single person, the more that every single country can do, the more we can mitigate the scale of the crisis. But what we really need to see is leadership at home, because for the last few months, we have been fighting this Conservative government, which wanted to have a new coal mine. It scrapped grants for the green homes. It scrapped grants for electric vehicles, charging points. We need to see far more action at home, and then we need to see that leadership taken onto the global stage as well.
Matt, do you want to respond then about the Conservative government?
We're leading the way. We've got a commitment to net zero by 2050. In my part of the world, we're leading the green revolution. Whatever it might be, hydrogen, huge investments in hydrogen. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was looking at sustainable air fuels. We are leading the way. The reality is that the UK only generates 1.1% of the world's emissions. We can cut that down to wherever we want, unless we start tackling, China's 30% in the stakes. We're not getting anywhere. But I think the way that we're doing it, we lead the way. We invest in the technology, we share the technology and hope we can make the world a greener place together.
Right, well, Tamandra, where are you? Do you sense any despair when you hear John Kerry talk about the sort of picture that he sees unless China takes the sort of action that is necessary? What's the point of us doing it here?
I heard some of his speech this morning, and he was very upbeat about how it would be a better life for everybody. And it made me think about some of the government initiatives here, where it's just slowly emerging that actually, in order to get these targets, everybody's home heating bills will go up and it will be much less affordable to run a car. And let's face it, I mean, unless there's a huge turnaround, it's simply going to be impossible for everybody to have an electric car. It's just not going to be feasible. People will be less likely to be able to travel abroad when that's possible again. And it made me think, well, we're not really told the current policies to tackle this thing. We're not really told what the cost is going to be. It's only starting to creep out. It's looking to me like, for a lot of people, their lives will be dialed back to more like what my grandparents had, where they didn't have central heating or hot water and they never had a car and they got to go abroad entirely once in their life. That actually everyone is being asked to pay a price for this by having more limited lives. And I don't remember ever being asked to vote for that. I mean, it takes us really back to our democracy discussion at the start of the programme. No party has said, vote for us, we're going to hit these targets by making your heating bills bigger and taking your car away and stopping you going abroad.
Right. Well,
and if they had, I think that people might have started to say, hang on, is this the only way to tackle climate change? What about, I mean, these technology things sound great, but...
Daisy, you're shaking your head.
There is a really big opportunity here. We mustn't see that action to tackle the climate emergency is going to make our lives worse. Under Liberal Democrats' proposals, we would be insulating people's homes and thereby ending fuel poverty. We would be investing in the trains so people can travel more by public transport and divert the funding that the Conservatives are putting into building, £27 million worth into the roads. There are ways in which we can create the green jobs of the future and actually stimulate new economies around the UK. There are ways in which you can tackle the climate emergency and make people's lives better and make the economy better too. There can be a win-win situation, but we need leadership at the national and the international level to be able to do that.
Right, are you signed up to that, Tamandra?
Well, who gets to define what is better? I think, Ken, this is like you might think it's better if we don't have cars and we go everywhere by train, but not everybody thinks that. In fact, the access to independent motor transport transformed the lives of the working classes of this country from the 1960s onwards. And I don't think it's necessarily better for everybody's life if we are forced back to choosing between bicycles, buses and trains.
Right. I mean, Richard, shouldn't people in your area take the requisite action that's needed to cut emissions and don't worry too much about what's happening in China because it'll be better for you anyway?
I think we were talking about choice earlier, and I struggle to see that we have got a choice as individuals. And I think Daisy was quite right when she said every single one of us has a responsibility. As nice as it might sound, we do not want to be living in Norwich-on-Sea in however many years. Climate change is really acute potentially here in the east of England with regards to rising sea levels. I also think that there is opportunities here. We're in the process of having one of the largest wind farms in the world off off the Norfolk coast. And there are jobs there. There is opportunity for people to make a living from this change as well. And I think that we simply don't have a choice. We need to tackle this, or else we face, ruin. And we've got to get that message across to people so they understand. I still think there is some hesitancy from people who think, oh, we'll sort it out tomorrow. But the day has come to sort it out, frankly.
All right, well, look, let's just show you inside the House of Commons chamber. As you will know, it's been pretty empty over the last year or so. You can see a few more people gathering for Prime Minister's questions since the restrictions are being lifted at the beginning of this week. Is that something that you welcome, Matt? More people in the chamber?
Very, very much so. I think you know what? Democracy is about scrutiny. It's about everybody having a go, having an input, and getting people in that chamber is a huge part of that.
Right, but what about the fact that the MPs are in a crowded space? They won't have to wear masks. They won't have to provide proof of vaccination. Is that a good idea?
I think I can't imagine that there are many MPs who haven't been vaccinated, but do you know what? It's not that crowded a space. There is still some element of self-control. Nobody was sat next to each other yesterday when I was in, and no, I wasn't wearing a mask.
Right. Daisy, what about you? Are your fellow MPs in there?
I'm not sure who's in Parliament today. Some MPs have been back in Parliament. Some are preferring to work from home for personal health reasons and other reasons as well. I, for one, am happy to go into the chamber. I'll be wearing my mask as long as people respect sort of social distancing, for as long as we're dealing with COVID. I think if anybody came and sat right next to me without wearing a mask, I probably would have to leave the chamber and would want to take part virtually. So for as long as there's adequate self-regulation, I'm okay with that. But I mean, we have to make sure that that is not just in the chamber, but right across the parliamentary estate. Right, and recess is happening tomorrow, Tamandra. Are you happy to see more people back? Is it important for democracy?
Oh, it's absolutely crucial for democracy. I think, having face-to-face, being held to account, being able to read the facial expressions of people while you're talking, I imagine, is quite a key part of doing politics. But just being able to hold the government to account live and in person, I don't think there's any replacement for it. And we've sorely missed it over the last 18 months. I think a lot of things have slid through with very little scrutiny.
All right,
just the other important part of that actually is it's not just about what goes on in the chamber and scrutiny, it's about the actual chit-chat you had with the minister that secures the stuff for your constituents. I think we're going into the chamber in a moment, but of course remember that Boris Johnson is self-isolating, so he will be answering the questions remotely from Keir Starmer for this final Prime Minister's questions. Sorry, I interrupted you, Matt. Carry on. No, I think actually when you become an MP, you realise most of the magic doesn't happen in the chamber. It's not all the theatre and the banging, it's the bit you do in the tea room. And here he is.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be joining the House in the 60th anniversary edition of Prime Minister's Question Time, which, as you have rightly just pointed out, was, of course, an innovation introduced under Harold Macmillan, and look forward to answering colleagues' questions today. Mr. Speaker, before the House rises for summer recess tomorrow, I know that everyone will want to join me in thanking parliamentary and constituency staff and the dedicated House of Commons staff for hard work over the last year. And I hope very much that everyone has a restful break. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings, virtual meetings, I should say, with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my virtual duties in this House, I shall have further such virtual meetings later today.
Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I echo the Prime Minister's thanks to all our staff for their hard work this last year. I very much welcome the government's levelling up agenda to ensure opportunity and economic freedoms are enjoyed by every person across our 4 nations. Hastings and Rye is being held back, prevented from achieving its potential, largely or partly due to a lack of transport infrastructure. Will my right honourable friend promise to consider the business case for the HS1 extension from Ashford through to Hastings, Bexhill and Eastbourne and commit to the funding necessary?
My honourable friend is a fantastic advocate for the people of Hastings and Rye, and she's made the case to me before for the improvement to transport that she recommends. I know that the particular extension is being reviewed by the Department of Transport right now. A decision will be made in due course, and I'm told I simply cannot anticipate that. But what I can say is that this is the government and the party that is absolutely determined to level up across our country with better infrastructure, superb innovation, Mr. Speaker, and better skills across the whole of the UK.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also thank you and all of the House of Commons staff for everything you've done to keep Parliament open and safe? Can I wish the Prime Minister that the Chequers won well in his isolation? With 500,000 people self-isolating, I think we're all a bit surprised that the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Cabinet Office Minister were all randomly chosen for a get-out-of-isolation free card. But it's good that the Prime Minister finally recused himself, even if it took a public outcry for the Communities Secretary to be humiliated on live TV and a trip to a country estate. Mr. Speaker, if someone is pinged by the NHS app, as millions will be over coming weeks, should they isolate? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, is the answer to that. And I think that everybody understands the inconvenience of being pinged, as he rightly says. Here I am. I wish I was with you in the Commons chamber today. I apologise to everybody in business up and down the land in all kinds of services, public sector or otherwise, who are experiencing inconvenience. We will be switching, as the House knows, to a system based on contact testing rather than contact isolation. But until then, Mr. Speaker, I must remind everybody that isolation is a vital tool of our defence against the disease. You're 5 times more likely to catch it if you've been in contact with someone that gets it, someone that has it. And of course, even if you have been vaccinated, you can still pass it on, though that risk is reduced. And the overwhelming arguments, Mr. Speaker, are for getting a jab. Everybody should get a jab.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says that everyone understands the government's position as to what you should do if you're pinged by the NHS app. That's a very interesting answer, because the government's all over the place on this. Yesterday, his business minister said the app was an advisory tool only. Another government minister, and I kid you not, said yesterday the app is just to allow you to make informed decisions. What on earth does that mean? Allow you to make informed decisions. And of course, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor spent the weekend trying to dodge isolation altogether. So, Mr. Speaker, the British people are trying to follow the rules. How can they, when his ministers keep making them up as they go along?
No, Mr. Speaker. If I may laboriously repeat the answer that I gave earlier on to the right honourable gentleman, so it's just to get it into his head yet again. Isolation is a very important part of our armoury against COVID. We're going forward, as everybody knows, to a new system on August the 16th, based on testing. But in the meantime, when you're advised to isolate, to protect others and to protect your family against the spread of the disease, then you should do so. And of course, even more important than the isolation campaign is, of course, the vaccination campaign. 3 million people of the 18 to 30 group still to get one. I think the right honourable gentleman's time would be more usefully employed, if I may say so, encouraging everybody to get vaccinated.
Keir Starmer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, everything may be calm from the Prime Minister's country retreat, but back here, the truth is, we're heading for a summer of chaos. There's a lot of noise, Mr. Speaker, right? I hope they've all got their NHS app on. Mr. Speaker, we're heading for a summer of chaos. 1 million children were out of school last week. 1 million. And a huge number of businesses are closing because so many staff are self-isolating. So let me turn to the question of exemptions. Yesterday, the messages coming out of Number 10 about which businesses and workers might be exempt from isolation changed hour by hour. First, yesterday, there was going to be a list, and then there wasn't. And then the Prime Minister's spokesperson said this, and I quote, "We are not seeking to draw lines specifically around who is or who is not exempt." Now, I've read that, and I've reread it several times, Mr. Speaker. I haven't a clue what that means. The Road Haulage Association hit the nail on the head when they said this, and I quote, that it was thought up on the hoof without proper organisation or thought. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister likes to govern by three-word slogans. I think, Mr. Speaker, on the hoof might work pretty well. So, last chance before recess. For millions of workers, this matters.
Order. Mr. Gullis, I don't need any help or assistance from yourself. The next time you point to your watch, might be better looking at Big Ben outside rather than here. Come on, Keir Starmer.
So, Mr. Speaker, last chance before recess. Can the Prime Minister just clear it up which workers and which businesses will be exempt from isolating before the 16th of August?
Mr. Speaker, I think this is really pretty feeble stuff from the right honourable gentleman. This what's going to be a glorious 60th anniversary edition of PMQs. I've given him the answer in a letter that he had earlier on about the businesses and the sectors of industry that we think that it would be sensible now to exempt. But he can't have it both ways, Mr. Speaker. He attacks the self-isolation system. But as far as I understand the position of the right honourable gentleman when it comes to the roadmap, he actually now this week opposes going forward with step 4 as we have on as we did on Monday. He wants to keep this country, as far as I understand his position, in lockdown. And now which is it? He can't have it both ways. He can't simultaneously, Mr. Speaker, attack.
Prime Minister. Prime Minister, just a moment. We're really struggling on the sound level. I don't know whether we can actually have the sound level turned up to hear the Prime Minister.
I'm sorry.
OK. Thank you, Prime Minister. Otherwise, you've got a great stand-in who's quite desperate. But I want to hear this, Prime Minister.
Do you want me to have another go, Mr. Speaker? Hang on a minute. Is it this thing here?
I want quite well. People were decided to be quite rowdy, but I can hear you now. Continue halfway through.
Can you hear me, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, can you hear me?
Can hear you loud and clear, Prime Minister.
Do you want me to give that answer again?
Oh, don't worry. Just complete the end bit.
I'm very happy. I will repeat it. I'll say it as many times as you like. I think the right honourable gentleman, the leader of the opposition, is guilty of failing to listen to what I said just now. And it's perfectly obvious that, as I said to him in a letter earlier on, that there are some businesses, some parts of our economy that, of course, need exemptions from the isolation regime because they need to be able to carry on. And for the most part, obviously, people will have to follow the rules. We're changing it on August the 16th, by which time we will have vaccinated many more people. I understand people's frustrations, but this is one of the few real tools that we have in our armoury against the virus. And I really think that in attacking the isolation system, which is what I think the right honourable gentleman is doing, he is being totally inconsistent with his earlier announcement, which seemed to be that we should stay in lockdown. If I understand the position of the Labour Party now, which is different from last week, they now don't want to go ahead with step 4. I think I'm right in that.
Kirsten.
He talks about inconsistency. 2 hours and 38 minutes to do a massive U-turn on Sunday morning. And then what have we seen in the last few days? He says I didn't listen to his answer. I did listen. I still think he's making it up. We had completely unclear announcement on Monday about exemptions, had contradictory statements all day yesterday. Now we seem to be back to the confused policy of Monday. How on earth the business is meant to plan when the Prime Minister keeps chopping and changing like this? I have to say, even after 15 months of these exchanges, I can't believe that the Prime Minister doesn't see the irony of him spending Freedom Day locked in isolation and announcing plans for a vaccine ID card. I remember when he used to say he'd eat an ID card if he ever had to produce one, and now he's introducing them. So, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to creating confusion, the Prime Minister is a super spreader. So let me try to get some clarity. Why is it okay? Why is it okay to go to a nightclub for the next 6 weeks without proof of a vaccine or a test, and then from September it will only be okay to get into a nightclub if you've got a vaccine ID card?
Hey, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Labour leader traditionally has a choice in a national crisis, and that is whether to get behind the government and to offer constructive opposition, or to try endlessly to oppose for the sake of it and to try to score cheap political points. Everybody can see that we have to wait until the end of September, by which time it's only fair to the younger generation, when they will all have been offered 2 jabs, before we consider something like asking people to be double jabbed before they go into a nightclub. That's blindingly obvious to everybody. It's common sense. And I think most people in this country understand it. Most people in this country want to see the younger generation encouraged to get vaccinations. That is what, with great respect to the Right Honourable Gentleman, he should be doing, rather than trying endlessly to score what I think are vacuous political points.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister keeps asking me if I will support his chaos. No! And I want to bring the Prime Minister back to one of our earlier exchanges in this House. On the 26th of May, I asked the Prime Minister if he'd ever used the words, "COVID is only killing 80-year-olds," or words to that effect. On that day, the Prime Minister pointedly didn't deny using those words. And now we have the proof that he did. We've all now seen the Prime Minister's text message. I quote, "The median age for COVID fatalities is 82. That is above life expectancy." And we have the Prime Minister's conclusion in the same text. "So get COVID and live longer." Remind the Prime Minister, over 83,000 people aged 80 or over lost their lives to this virus. Everyone leaving behind a grieving family and loved ones. So will the Prime Minister now apologise for using those words?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, nothing I can say from this dispatch box, or from this virtual dispatch box, I should say, or nothing I can do can make up for the loss and the suffering that people have endured throughout this pandemic. And there will, of course, be a public inquiry into what has happened. But I would just remind the Right Honourable Gentleman, when he goes back over the decision-making processes that we had in those very, very difficult and dark times, that these are incredibly tough balancing decisions that you have to take. Again, you have to balance the catastrophe of the disease against the suffering that is caused by lockdowns, the impacts on mental health, the loss of life chances for young people, Mr. Speaker. And what has changed since we were thinking in those ways is, of course, that we have rolled out vaccines faster than any other country in Europe. 96%, Mr. Speaker, of people over 50 now have had a vaccine. 68% of people have had 2 jabs, Mr. Speaker. What we're trying to say to the country today, and I think the single most important serious message is, if you have not yet had your second jab, please come along and get it. And if you're over 50 and you still haven't had your second jab, or over 40, please come and get it as well. And never forget, Mr. Speaker, that if we'd followed the advice of the Right Honourable Gentleman, we would have stayed in the European Medicines Agency, and we would never have had the vaccine rollout at all.
Starmer.
Speaker, I think we might need to check that the line to checkers is working, because the Prime Minister's answers have no resemblance to the questions I'm actually asking him. He's given us a list of what he can't do. What he can do, quite straightforwardly, virtually or otherwise, is say sorry. The trouble is, Mr. Speaker, nobody believes a word the Prime Minister says anymore. He promised he had a plan for social care, but he's ducked it for 2 years. He promised not to raise tax. Now he's planning a jobs tax. He promised he wouldn't cut the army or the aid budget. He's cut both. And, Mr. Speaker, he also promised that Monday would be Freedom Day. He said 18 times from that dispatch box that it'd be irreversible. But the truth is, he's let a new variant into the country, he's let cases soar, and he's left us with the highest death toll in Europe, one of the worst hit economies of any major economy. Last week, 1 million kids were off school, businesses are closing, and millions will spend their summer self-isolating. But don't worry, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's got it all under control. Because this morning we read he's got a new 3-word slogan. Keep life moving. You couldn't make it up. Mr. Speaker, isn't it clear there's only 3 words this Prime Minister needs to focus on? Get a grip.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's look at the position now as it was at the end of last year. And as we come to the end of this parliamentary term, let's be absolutely clear that it is thanks to the vaccine rollout, which, by the way, I never tire of repeating, would have been impossible if we'd followed his advice, that 9 million people have now come off furlough. Unemployment is 2 million lower than predicted. Job vacancies, Mr. Speaker, are 10% higher than they were before the pandemic began. Business insolvencies are lower than before the pandemic began. He wants 3-word slogans, Mr. Speaker. I'll give him a 3-word slogan. Our 3-word slogan is get a jab. And get a jab. And by the way, what we're also doing is help people to get a job. We're turning jabs, jabs, jabs into jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the agenda of this government by taking sensible, cautious decisions, rolling out the vaccines in the way that we have. We have been able to get this country moving and to keep it moving. And I've listened to him very carefully this morning. I have absolutely no idea what he proposes to do instead, except keep us all in some sort of perpetual lockdown and limbo. He has no answer to the question of if not now, when. He has no plan, he has no ideas, and he has no hope, Mr. Speaker. And whilst we in this government are getting on with getting our country through the pandemic and delivering on the people's priorities.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Levelling Up Fund is a very welcome investment in Montgomeryshire. It's a game changer for our county council and critical investment at this very critical time. Specifically, we would like to reopen the Montgomery Canal. It's our levelling up bid. It sadly was disconnected from the UK network some decades ago and has been kept alive by a terrific team of volunteers. Will the Prime Minister use the weight of his office and, like the Secretary of State for Wales, jump on the boat, get this investment over the waterline and deliver this levelling up bid in mid-Wales?
Prime Minister.
I congratulate my honourable friend on the campaign he's running for what sounds like an absolutely beautiful plan to reopen the Montgomery Canal. He won't have long to wait for the decision on that scheme, but I can assure him that Wales is receiving thumping quantities of the UK's Levelling Up Fund, already 5% of total UK allocations in the first round will be in Wales, and I thank him for the lobbying that he's put in today.
Let's go to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you very much. Of course, while they're talking about levelling up on the government benches, we in Scotland are looking at settling up for the people of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, I hope the Prime Minister will be reflecting on the judgment from the Parliamentary and Health Ombudsman yesterday that judged that there was maladministration in dealing with the 1950s WASPy women. It's about time that the government delivered justice for those involved. Mr. Speaker, last night we heard from the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff. On the 15th of October, the Prime Minister didn't believe that the NHS would be overwhelmed and thought that the over-80s should be sacrificed to the whims of the deadly virus. The Prime Minister wrote those words whilst our NHS was facing the darkest moments in its history. While doctors and nurses were fighting to contain the pandemic, the Prime Minister was actively pushing for the virus to be allowed to run rampant through towns and cities. The Prime Minister was willing, in his own words, to allow the bodies to be piled high. Mr. Speaker, on October the 15th, 2020, 60,000 people had already died. How can anyone have put faith and trust in a Prime Minister who actually typed the words, "Get COVID and live longer"?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the right honourable gentleman gracefully mischaracterises the substance of those discussions. What I said, I've made points in the House of Commons already in the chamber about the language that I'm alleged to have used. But I think what everybody in this country understands is that the decisions that we had to take at that time were incredibly difficult. And of course, this in no way detracts from the grief and the suffering of those who have lost loved ones to COVID, whose families have been hit by the consequences of that disease. But as I said earlier to the Labour leader, we have to balance very, very difficult harms on either side. There are no good ways through, Mr. Speaker. A lockdown also causes immense suffering and a loss of life chances and damage to health and to mental health. And in due course, the Right Honourable Gentleman knows very well that there will be a chance to look at all of this in a full public inquiry. But I must tell the House that I am content that we followed the scientific guidance and we did whatever we could to save life and to minimise suffering, and of course, to protect our wonderful NHS.
Blackford.
Is that it? Is that it, Prime Minister? Because, you know, the reality is that the Prime Minister wrote these words himself. The over-80s were expendable. A Prime Minister is charged with protecting society, not putting folk at risk of an early death. Such a glib attitude towards human life is indefensible. The Prime Minister is simply not fit for office. The clear pattern throughout this pandemic is that it's one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us. The reality, Mr. Speaker, that the only way to get to the full truth over this UK government's disastrous handling of the pandemic is for this cabal to be made to answer under oath. So, will the Prime Minister confirm that in the interests of public health and confidence, that the COVID inquiry will begin immediately and commit to appearing at the inquiry himself under oath before any general election is called?
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate why it's so important for this country to have a full public inquiry, and that's why I made the announcement to the House that we would. And I also think that it's right that it should go ahead as soon as is reasonable. I don't think that right now, in the middle of a third wave, when we're seeing many of the key people involved in fighting the pandemic who were very, very heavily occupied, I don't think it's right to ask them to devote a lot of their time to a public inquiry of the kind that I think we would all want to see. And that's why I think it's right that it should start in the spring, when I'm pretty confident, and so are the rest of the scientific community, that we will really be in a much, much better position and able to go ahead. And that is the time to begin the public inquiry. But that doesn't mean, Mr. Speaker, that we aren't continuing to learn lessons all the time.
We now have David Davis online. David Davis.
Mr. Speaker, 40 years ago, this country led the world in social mobility. Since then, we've fallen so far behind, we're now only 21st in the world rankings. If we're to succeed at levelling up the UK, then we must restore social mobility for working class pupils right across the country. The fastest and most cost-effective way to do that is to re-engineer the classroom, to capitalise on the benefits of modern technology, using artificial intelligence to provide lessons tailored to the ability of each and every child. Countries around the world are already doing this, from America to Australia, China to Estonia. And private schools in the UK, including Eton, are already doing it using world-class British technology. Will the Prime Minister undertake to use modern technologies to give every working-class child the opportunity to reach their full potential, opportunity based on their abilities, not on where they grew up or how rich their parents were?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm thankful to my right honourable friend for the personal tutorial he gave me in with using a laptop in the opportunities provided by this type of technology and the massive increase in the cognitive powers of kids that is now made possible by these types of technology. And we are looking at supporting schools across the whole of the UK with this kind of advance as we continue to level up.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Mr. Speaker, in light of the judicial ruling in the High Court that the Northern Ireland Protocol repeals Article 6 of the Act of Union, which allows for unimpeded trade within the United Kingdom and between the constituent parts of the UK, what does the Prime Minister intend to do to fully restore the active union for Northern Ireland and remove the Irish Sea border?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and this is my first opportunity publicly to congratulate him on becoming leader of the DUP. I look forward to working with him and with the whole of the executive in Northern Ireland for the people in Northern Ireland. As we've made clear and as we'll be setting out today, we want to sort out the issues in the protocol. We think there are practical steps you can take to do that. And as far as the court case is concerned, nothing in the protocol affects the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom or Northern Ireland's place within it.
Let's see if we can pick up the pace with Theo Clark. Theo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, I joined local health officials and members of the public at a consultation meeting on maternity services in Staffordshire. Maternity was temporarily suspended at Stafford's County Hospital at the height of the pandemic so that wards could be used to treat COVID-19 patients. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that anyone who wants to give birth at Stafford's County Hospital should be able to do so?
Let's go to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
My honourable friend raises a very, very important point, and a lot of the hospitals that I've been around recently are doing incredible work at getting back to pre-COVID levels of service, and I understand that NHS partners are working hard to explore options for restoring maternity services at County Hospital.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Together with the chairs of the committees dealing with social security in the Scottish Parliament, the Senedd and the Northern Ireland Assembly, we've made a call that the £20 a week cut in universal credit due in October should not go ahead. A new Joseph Rowntree Foundation report shows that if it does go ahead, out of work families with children will have an income way below what the general public regards as the minimum necessary for an acceptable standard of living. Instead of cutting down, will the Prime Minister not follow his own policy and level up and leave the £20 a week in place?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we want to do is level up across the whole of the UK by increasing jobs, access to high-wage, high-skilled jobs, and getting people off benefits and into work. And really that is the big difference between his party and the party I lead. We want to help people into work, and I'm afraid that as so often, Labour wants to keep them on welfare. I don't think that's the right way forward. We want to see higher wages, and that's why we've increased the living wage by record amounts, and that's why we are working to ensure that this is a jobs-led recovery, and all the signs are at the moment that is succeeding. But of course, it depends on people getting those jabs and when they're asked to.
Let's go to Alberta Costa. Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the cautious move to step 4 this week, which has only been made possible due to the fantastic vaccine rollout in South Leicestershire and across our country, and the fact that every adult has now been offered the vaccine. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that if we don't move forward now, we risk opening up later in the autumn or winter when the NHS is under more pressure and children have returned to school, which seems to be the reckless approach of the party opposite?
Is spot on. He's completely right. The question for those who attack the current policy is if not now, when? We looked at the data this morning with the chief medical officer, and he pointed out the extraordinary difference in between the number of people being hospitalised now in the older generations and the number of people who are being hospitalised in previous waves amongst the older generations. Thanks to the vaccine rollout, we have radically changed the way the disease affects our society. It's that change that's enabling us to make the progress that we are. And as he says, if not now, when?
Let's go to Rosie Cooper. Rosie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government claims that fires in schools are very rare and are mostly confined to one room or cause little or no damage. The fire at Asmore Primary School in my constituency last month severely damaged 3 rooms, spreading far beyond the original site. This has had a devastating effect on the school, and the pupils now face 18 months of disruption to their education. Would the Prime Minister commit to a mandate that all new build schools and major refurbishments are installed with sprinklers so that schools don't suffer the same fate as Asmore Primary in Ormskirk?
Prime Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady very much, and I want to thank also the fire service for their outstanding response to the fire at Asmore Primary School. I'm sorry for the disruption that children are experiencing. We can't be complacent about fires at all, let alone fires in schools. And the Department for Education is consulting on guidance to improve fire safety in schools further. And I would encourage the Honourable Lady to make representations to in that consultation.
Margaret Furry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents has recently attempted to sell a house only for the surveyor and estate agent to inform him that they require an external wall system certificate. However, under current Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors guidance, an EWS 1 form should not be expected for properties and buildings under 18 metres high, which includes my constituent's property in Cambuslang. Will the Prime Minister clarify if the UK Government intends to take any steps to ensure lenders and others adhere to RICS guidance on EWS 1 forms, and will he meet with me to discuss how I can assist my constituent?
Prime Minister.
The Honourable Lady makes an extremely important point, and that's why my Right Honourable friend, the Housing Secretary, will be making a statement to the House shortly, because we must be clear that the risk from fire to life in homes is very, very low, and leaseholders should not be trapped in their properties, unable to buy or to sell because their properties have been unfairly maligned in that way. And lenders and valuers should not be asking for EWS 1 forms on buildings below 18 metres. My Right Honourable friend, the Housing Secretary, will be setting out more in a bit later on about how we propose to ensure that doesn't happen.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions there. You can continue watching on BBC Parliament, but we'll bring you any highlights if necessary, because it's time to welcome our guest for this part of the programme, Amanda Milling, co-chairman of the Conservative Party. Hello to you. And Thangam Debonair, welcome to you too, Shadow Leader of the House for the Labour Party, and the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Now, of course, we had the joys of Zoom because the Prime Minister is self-isolating. A little bit of a problem with the sound, according to Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, but we got over that. And in fact, Keir Starmer talked about, the Labour leader, a summer of chaos. He said that the lifting of restrictions has been reckless. And of course, he referred to the self-isolation of the Prime Minister after a brief interlude where he and others were going to be part of the pilot scheme or study of daily testing because they've been in contact with someone who tested positive, the Health Secretary. How is this looking as the last Prime Minister's questions?
Well, I think you can see that Labour has been trying to build up this theme. So all of the things that have been confusing or have gone slightly wrong or have been U-turns in the government's handling of COVID in the last few weeks, and trying to put them together all into this package that, to the public, according to Keir Starmer, looks chaotic. He accused the Prime Minister of being a super spreader of chaos. And I think, look, there is a sort of mood out there that has changed a lot in the last couple of weeks, when it looked like everything was sort of going well, cases would look like they were sort of under control, and the vaccine process was going... Right, I think we're definitely in a different sort of phase now. You know, I mean, lots of families having had kids at home, lots of people having absences at their workplace. You know, we may well have people watching us today who are stuck at home self-isolating. And I think there's a feeling as well in government among Tory MPs that actually things have been a bit rocky in the last couple of weeks, and Keir Starmer is trying to build on that theme and also accuse the Prime Minister of somebody who people are less and less willing to trust.
What about Keir Starmer himself and the Labour Party and an alternative to the action that's been taken by the government? Is there one?
Well, this is where it gets tricky for Labour in reverse, because, yes, there are some things that they emphasise differently. For example, Labour talks a lot about trying to help people put ventilation into properties and workplaces to try to help manage the risk of COVID. But broadly speaking, you know, Labour isn't saying...
And mandatory masks.
And mandatory masks, indeed, is another clarification. But broadly speaking, is Labour saying that the unlocking is completely wrong? Well, no, it's not. So the actual policy difference is maybe less extreme, well, certainly less extreme than the difference in rhetoric.
Right. We're going to talk about some of the issues that you've just raised there. But first of all, your interview with Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's former chief advisor. That was an exclusive and detailed interview with him, and he raised many things, but it was picked up today in Prime Minister's questions by both Keir Starmer and Ian Blackford for the SNP, particularly the disparaging WhatsApp messages about the over 80s and COVID. And he didn't deny it, did he?
No. I mean, Boris Johnson didn't deny that he had used that language. I mean, I don't think he can. You know, these were a series of WhatsApps that were sent to more than one other person. We've seen those messages. Downing Street hasn't denied the content of them. And the Prime Minister even referred to, we were thinking in those ways during that period of time when he was talking about the mid-autumn. But Ian Blackford, you know, in particular, actually, you know, pushed Boris Johnson very strongly on some of the language that he had used when he talked about get COVID, live longer. Now, what Boris Johnson appeared to say, which of course is true, is that the decisions on COVID and lockdowns are not completely straightforward. Of course they're difficult. The government was trying to balance protecting people's lives with protecting people's jobs and also protecting people from other kinds of health problems. You know, there was nothing that was completely straightforward about these decisions, but you're absolutely right. Boris Johnson didn't deny that, and I think that didn't deny what had happened. And I think that will be picked up by a lot of his opponents.
Right. Well, Amanda Milling, he didn't deny using that language. Do you want to apologise on the Prime Minister's behalf?
The Prime Minister set out, you know, some of the real difficult decisions that we had to make. It was a difficult decision to go into lockdowns because it's not just about the health, but also the impact it has on people's businesses, their livelihoods, and also their mental health. These are really challenging decisions.
Yes,
but I would say as well,
accept the decisions and the debate around it, but do you want to apologise for the language that he used in those WhatsApp messages?
Look, one of the things I was going to say is that actually when I've been going out and about around the country, which I have been doing over the last few weeks, one of the things that really strikes me is how the public recognise that these were difficult decisions. The government have had to do an enormous number of things to be able to support everyone. And also they've been on the side. They kind of recognise the difficulty that these decisions had.
But Amanda, do you think that if you had a relative who was over 80 who lost their life to COVID, that you would have been grateful to the government for their handling of the pandemic when you'd seen how the Prime Minister described those decisions back in the autumn?
So we've, you know, the number of sacrifices and the impact on people in terms of losing loved ones has been horrific. This is an awful virus. And this is why we've had to implement these measures to kind of cautiously and irreversibly come out of the lockdowns, but also importantly, getting these vaccinations into arms, because that was so key to protecting.
But Amanda, on the particular point, I mean, everybody knows, as you said, the public knows this was difficult. Everybody would acknowledge that it's always been a difficult balancing act. But don't you think actually hearing some of the language and some of the way in which the Prime Minister talked about these issues back in that very difficult autumn, maybe it would just be better to say, yeah, sorry, that was inappropriate, perhaps it was glib. Would you like to say that today?
So my heart goes out to those who've lost loved ones. And you know, we know that it was affecting kind of so many elderly people in particular. And that was why it was so important to get these vaccinations into arms so that we can protect people. And that was something that, you know, we did as a government, which has made a huge difference to the kind of this virus and the impact on people's lives.
All right, look, let me just draw your attention then to this in The Times. It was also raised by Keir Starmer, and it's the new slogan from the government. Keep life moving is new COVID slogan amid self-isolating confusion. What do you think of that slogan, Thangham?
Well, I mean, I think that this government has shown that having three-word slogans doesn't really solve anything. Amanda talks about they want to be cautious and irreversible in undoing the lockdown. And in fact, what we've got is complete chaos. That's not keeping life moving. It's actually causing such meltdown in certain businesses who are really struggling with the staffing problems that they've got because of being pinged. There's no consideration from the government of how that's affecting people's jobs and livelihoods. And just yesterday, we had the business minister, Paul Scully, saying that, oh, well, the app was just advisory. Now, the number 10 then had to reverse that minutes later. This is absolute chaos. It's not keeping life moving. It's making life very, very difficult for people. Of course, we all want to end these restrictions. Everybody does. But it will ring really hollow for those people who've had loved ones who've died, that we haven't got the public inquiry we need. It will ring really hollow for people whose loved ones over the age of 80 seem to have been treated with such disparagement by this Prime Minister. It's really going to hurt.
Right. I mean, keep life... Yeah, sorry, Amanda. Keep life moving. I mean, that's not what's happening, is it?
No, so what I was going to say to Thangen, though, is what is the Labour plan? Because we have absolutely no idea what the plan is. And this has been the case all the way through. There's a constant situation where they're kind of making comments from the sidelines, but actually we have no idea what the plan is. And in terms of the public inquiry, we've already said that will be a public inquiry, but now's not the time to do it.
Why is now not the time to do it? This is exactly when we need to learn those lessons. I think it's astonishing that the government says that what we're doing is making comments from the sideline. We're literally the opposition. That's literally our constitutional job, to scrutinise what the government's doing, to hold a mirror up to it, and to actually be a voice for British people who have been saying up and down the country that they feel it's one rule for the government and another for the rest of us, and it's leading to complete chaos.
Right, Thangen, would people expect you to have, though, an alternative plan? Because as I discussed with Laura just a few moments ago, you broadly do support the dates that have been set. You supported the lifting of restrictions. You are still sticking to the August 16th date of loosening the requirement to self-isolate if you've been double jabbed. And apart from mask wearing, and we can talk about ventilation in a moment, you are in line with what the government is doing.
There's any number of other things. For instance, we want there to be regular review points, which haven't been paid attention to. The government said it would pay attention to data, not dates. It's done the opposite. We would be driven by data. We also think that it's important that people who are asked to isolate, that there's proper consideration to giving them proper sick pay. That is causing problems. It's causing real hardship, and it's also undermining the very necessary protection effects of the track, trace and isolate system. If people are forced to choose between whether or not they can isolate and do the right thing for health reasons, or they're not going to be able to put food on the table. There's many things that we would do differently. Of course we want to unlock. Right. Everybody does, but not this chaos where ministers are saying one thing 1 minute and number 10 has to correct them the next.
All right, Amanda, I just want to go back to this idea of let's keep moving, because in the first week of July, more than 500,000 people were pinged. Many of those will be self-isolating. Yesterday, we found out that more than 1 million school children were out of school in England last week. That isn't moving, is it? It's stasis.
But the key thing about self-isolation is it's essential to be able to stop the spread of the virus and ensuring that we protect kind of family and friends. So that's why we have this. And from the 16th of August, we'll be moving on to testing. And so, but at the moment, the critical thing is that we all continue to play our part. And if we have been kind of contacted, that we have been in contact with somebody who has tested positive, then we do need to self-isolate. That's part of our armoury in terms of tackling this virus.
Right. Do you want to have more jobs added to the isolation exemption list, Amanda?
So we have set out that there are some kind of key workers who need to be able to be exempted so that we can keep these key kind of industries and sectors open. But, you know, at the end of the day, what we must do, we all have a role to play in terms of stopping the spread of the virus, which is why we need to continue to self-isolate when we're contacted.
Right, and Thangen, would you bring forward that August the 16th date when you could go to daily testing if you've come into contact with someone who has tested positive and you've had both your jabs?
Well, part of the problem at the moment is we couldn't go to daily testing because, as we've seen from numerous people over the course of the last few days, it's been almost impossible to book a PCR test or to order a lateral flow test from the government website. Monday, there seemed to be complete meltdown on the internet where it just didn't seem to be possible to book one anywhere. Now, that should have been predicted, that on the day, the so-called Freedom Day, the day when we were opening up, we just might need a proper provision of tests. That's a government failure. So we're looking ahead as far as August the 16th at the moment. Yeah. I'm struggling to see how the government will get to the end of the week.
Right. Well, if the testing capacity was there, would you like to see that date brought forward?
Well, as I said, we'd need to be guided by the data. We'd need to have good review points. And that is a few weeks ahead yet. We don't yet know what's going to happen with the unlocking and what effect that's going to have on transmission.
Laura?
Amanda, can I just pick you up on something that you were saying about the public inquiry? I wonder if you could answer a question that the Prime Minister didn't answer. When the public inquiry comes, should the witnesses be under oath?
So, you know, in terms of the public inquiry and actually kind of how that operates will set out in due course. I think the key thing in terms of the public inquiry is that it will happen when it's the right thing to do. Right now, the main thing is we're continuing to have to deal with this pandemic, with the virus, learning to live with it, and most importantly, getting these vaccines rolled out.
But Amanda, if you're trying to reassure people that the government really will try to work out what went wrong so that it doesn't happen again, don't people need to know that it will actually get to the truth? And for that, surely that does require people to be under oath. That's not a question about the terms or anything like that. It's a question of principle. Do you believe that people should be asked to give evidence under oath?
So, understandably, people want the public inquiry to answer the questions and so that we can learn the lessons. This is really, really important.
Yeah, and should the witnesses be under oath?
In terms of the public inquiry and how that will operate, you know, we'll set that out in due course.
All right, let's talk about COVID passports. Thangam, as you know, the government has now said that there have to be vaccine passports for entering nightclubs from the end of September, after previously saying it wasn't the plan, and Keir Starmer has criticised Boris Johnson for it. So can I take from that, including the fact that the Labour leader says that sort of passport would be very un-British, that you don't support the plan?
Well, I think the problem that the Prime Minister's got at the moment is that he's set in the hospitality industry even more chaos than before. He's added a layer of chaos onto layer of chaos.
Right.
He's done a U-turn on this, and he's the one with access to the data. Now, what I can't see at the moment is how nightclubs in my patch are supposed to plan what on earth is happening over the next few weeks. And I'd like to know what's different, what's changed, what's different between now and then. He said something in Prime Minister's question today, which he said he thought British people would understand this. I don't think they would, to be honest. Either it was right to open up nightclubs on Monday or it wasn't. Right. Now, if he's going to change the rules in 6 weeks' time, that just simply doesn't make sense.
I'll get Amanda to respond to that. But what about you? I mean, what's your position going to be? Will you vote against it?
We'll see when the proposal comes, and at the moment I don't know what that proposal is going to look like because, as usual, we don't have decent detail, and that is bad for businesses. So I don't know what we'll be asked to vote for because the government hasn't given us anything other than a headline.
Right, but except if the vote is straightforwardly, do you support vaccine passports? You have to be double jabbed to get entry into nightclubs. Will it be a yes or a no from you?
Well, as I said, it depends what's on that motion. It won't be straightforward. It will have to include things like medical exemptions. What about people who, for some reason or other, are not allowed to vaccinate? There's all sorts of things there which we'll need to see in the proposal. We haven't got that in front of us. When we see it, then we'll make a decision.
But and it is a question of principle, though, isn't it? I mean, is it the right thing or the wrong thing on a point of principle of venues to have to ask people for evidence of vaccination? Do you support the principle or not?
I mean, it's pretty tough to pick on just nightclubs. Why just nightclubs? Why nightclubs and not cinemas? Why not pubs? We've seen in the last few weeks people enjoying themselves, and I'm not knocking it, but people have been crowding into pubs before so-called Freedom Day. Where was the attention then? No, if we're going to encourage people to take vaccines, and we definitely must, I think actually threatening specific leisure activities and not others is not particularly helpful. And it's really going to lead to young people feeling that they're being picked on.
Right. I mean, I just want to probe a little bit further because you've got Tory rebels who are lining up to vote against this on the basis of civil liberties. You could inflict a defeat on the government here. In fact, they are calling many of these rebels on the Labour Party to stand up to this idea of a passport to gain entry to nightclubs. So is it something you'll do?
I can't decide on behalf of my party what we'll do about a motion that isn't yet in front of us. It will depend on what's the detail, what's the actual practicalities of how they're going to implement it. Are they going to be putting people on the door of a nightclub in a position where they've actually got to police this? What's going to be the backup? We don't know any of those things yet, so I can't give an answer to a motion that doesn't yet exist.
Right. Well, Amanda, we heard from the government they had no plans to do this. What's changed?
So, look, I think the first thing I want to say is, Thangam sitting on the fence.
Yeah,
he either agrees with the principle or doesn't agree.
Fine, well, we've done that.
So what we're trying to do throughout this pandemic, we've been dealing with following the advice, both scientific and medical. You know, we are.
So why did you open nightclubs a few days ago, and now at the end of September you're going to say you can't get into them unless you've had a double vaccination?
But this is a sector this have been shut for 18 months now. Right. You know, we want to get the country up and running. We want these businesses to open. But obviously we can't introduce kind of passports in the short term because we've still got a lot of people to get their jabs. And most importantly, we do need everyone to come forward for their first jab or their second jab, depending where they're up to, so that, you know, we are protecting each other. We're protecting family and friends.
Right. Can you rule out that it won't be extended to entry into pubs, for example?
Look, as I say, at this point in time, you know, we are with nightclubs and there's some kind of large gatherings where, you know, vaccine passports might be necessary. But, you know, we have to look at all points in time and what the data and the situation we're faced with. And as we know, this virus we've seen difficulties over the last few months. But the most important thing we're trying to do is make sure that we keep businesses open.
Right. So you can't rule it out, though. I mean, it's guidance at the moment for businesses to make up their own minds, but you can't rule out mandating double vaccinated passports to be used to gain entry into other hospitality venues.
So, look, we've set out the position for kind of nightclubs going into the end of September. But, you know, we can keep everything under review, as we have done throughout this entire pandemic.
Right. Let's have a look at the state of the parties, Laura, because it was the final Prime Minister's question.
It was, yes.
And they are heading into a summer recess. Chaos as Labour see it, not if you're the government. What's it mean, though, for both the leaders and both their parties? I'm just going to show this graph, actually, just with the net approval ratings while you're talking, which shows the party leaders. You can see Boris Johnson is at minus 13%, been a big drop. You talked earlier, perhaps the vaccine bounce is beginning to wear off. But Keir Starmer is at minus 14%. I hope both our guests could hear that. Minus 13% for Boris Johnson and minus 14% for Keir Starmer as we stand in. This is from Survation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think either of them are going to look at those kinds of numbers and think that it's been a great few weeks for them. I mean, I think, broadly speaking, the kind of arc, if you like, of this last few months has been, you know, that the government felt that they'd had a pretty good run in terms of that vaccine programme that did, you know, it changed people's lives, no question. It created a certain sort of feel-good factor after a terrible time, and there was a lot of sort of optimism around that. Clearly, the messiness around the unlock has kind of shifted that sense in Westminster. And I also do think that there has been in the Tory party, after the Prime Minister's speech last week that didn't seem to have very much in it, there are some Conservatives who are sort of wandering around thinking, what are we actually doing with this enormous majority? You know, clearly this has been a very, very difficult thing for the government to do in terms of handling the pandemic. Also, a lot of the public have been really willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt. But going into the summer, there really is that question mark in some Conservatives' minds about whether or not Boris Johnson does really have a strong grip and whether or not he's really sure what he wants to do with that majority. And for Labour, though, there is still an anxiety about what Keir Starmer really stands for. A lot of pressure on him heading into the party conference, which is going to be a huge thing to sort of settle nerves of the party. But great relief that they just held on in Batley, which I know that was a few weeks ago. I know it was just one by-election. But that kind of put a break, if you like, on what was quite a tricky situation.
We haven't got very long. Amanda, why do you think Boris Johnson's favourability rating has dropped 10 points in the last month?
So, look, I don't recognise this. I'm out, as I said earlier on, I'm out and about on the doorstep all the time. And one of the things I do see is a huge amount of support for the Prime Minister, you know, in terms of what we've delivered despite the pandemic over the last 18 months since the general election, and also what we're looking to do in terms of getting those police officers recruited, the nurses, more money for the NHS and education, and also levelling up. And over the summer, I will be going to visit constituencies up and down the country to see levelling up in action. Right.
Well, levelling up in action, of course, is the big question. Action rather than the rhetoric. Thangan, what about for you? Disappointing to see this Survation poll at minus 14% for Keir Starmer?
Well, I mean, polls are always make sobering reading. I think we all have to take them seriously. However, we have, as Laura said, we won battle in Spain and we were predicted to do much worse than just not win it. I think we won it from various reasons, but I included on the doorstep, I was getting people who said that they were Tory voters who were absolutely appalled by what the Tory government had done over the course of the pandemic. People also aren't fools. They know that if the Tories are saying we're going to boost police numbers, that's only to try and mend some of the damage that's happened under successive Tory governments over the last 10 years. People know perfectly well what's happening in their neighbourhoods. And I've had people contact me just over this weekend who are really despairing at this idea that there's one rule for the Tory government and another for the rest of us, on whether it's social distancing for Matt Hancock or it's social isolation for the Prime Minister.
All right, just very briefly, Laura, busy summer or quiet summer, do you think, politically?
I think probably quite a quiet summer, but my goodness, the number of times I've said it. Well, it looks like we might have a bit of a break now.
Yes, well, that's an impossible question. Listen, thank you very much to
loud.
Thangham and Amanda for being our guests for this part of the programme. That is all we have time for. That was the final PMQs of this session. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15 with the last Politics Live.